He arrived too late and immediately became a laughingstock, because instead of building a house, he decided to survive the winter living in a tree, and no one believed he would last more than a few days. But when brutal cold struck and a storm began, what happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. The cold state lay far north of the routes most people chose when they still had a choice. Winter arrived here not as a season, but as a verdict, final and indifferent, delivered earlier each year and enforced longer than anyone ever felt prepared for. The settlement sat at the edge of a dense conifer forest, where the land rose gently toward low mountains and the trees grew thick enough to block the wind only in certain pockets. By late autumn, the sun no longer climbed high enough to warm the ground. It skimmed the horizon for a few pale hours before slipping away, leaving the valley in long blue shadows that smelled of snow. The place had been built around the assumption that cold was inevitable and mercy was not. Houses were spaced far enough apart to reduce fire risk, but close enough that smoke from one chimney could be seen from another. Piles of split wood stood beside nearly every structure, stacked with care, covered with tarps weighed down by stones. Axe marks were visible everywhere, on stumps, on logs, on door frames, proof of weeks of labor invested in the simple goal of staying alive. Even before the first deep freeze, the settlement already lived in winter mode. People measured time not by days, but by how much wood remained, how long the walls would hold, how many repairs could still be made before the ground froze solid. Those who had arrived early carried themselves with a quiet confidence. They had built their homes in the accepted way, rectangular cabins raised above ground, thick log walls packed with whatever insulating material could be found. Their roofs sloped steeply to shed snow, their stoves sat at the center of daily life. These were men and women who believed in rules learned through repetition. Cut enough wood, build thick walls, keep the fire going. Anything outside that formula was treated not as innovation, but as threat. Into this closed system arrived a man who did not fit. He came late, later than anyone else that year, when the first hard frosts had already sealed shallow puddles with ice, and the soil rang beneath a boot heel. His truck followed the narrow road into the settlement under a sky already heavy with the promise of snow. He parked near the edge, not drawing attention to himself, and stepped out with the quiet economy of someone used to traveling light. His clothing was worn but clean. His movements were deliberate, measured, as if he were already conserving energy for something ahead. He was a black man in a place where very few people looked like him, and fewer still arrived alone, without a house already standing or a crew waiting. Heads turned, conversations paused. It was not curiosity alone that marked their attention, but calculation. Everyone here understood that winter turned mistakes into burdens, and burdens into emergencies that affected everyone. A man who arrived unprepared was not just risking his own life. He was gambling with theirs. He did not announce himself. He did not ask questions. He took possession of a narrow plot of land at the forest's edge, where the ground rose slightly and the trees grew older and thicker than elsewhere. It was not a convenient spot. It was farther from the road and farther from other homes. The soil there was darker, layered with years of fallen needles and slow decay. To most eyes, it looked like the worst place to build anything. From the beginning, the settlement marked him as temporary. People assumed he would either fail quickly or leave. They watched him from a distance as he walked the perimeter of his land, stopping often, kneeling, touching the ground with bare hands despite the cold. They saw no lumber deliveries arrive for him, No stacks of logs appear, no clear foundation laid out with stakes and string. He did not begin the ritual they recognized, and that alone made him suspect. The unspoken hierarchy of the settlement placed experience above all else. Those who had survived previous winters spoke with authority, even when their knowledge was limited to what had worked before. Tradition here was not cultural but practical, born of fear and reinforced by survival. The cabins stood as monuments to that belief, each one declaring that the right way was the only way. The stranger disrupted that certainty simply by existing outside it. As days passed, his presence became a topic of conversation, then of ridicule. People wondered aloud how long he thought he could last sleeping in a truck or a tent. They joked about how the cold would teach him lessons faster than any neighbor could. Some framed their mockery as concern, warning that the ground itself would freeze him if he tried to wait too long. Others were less charitable, taking comfort in the idea that nature would enforce the rules they believed in. He heard them. He always heard them. But he did not respond. Instead of cutting trees for walls, he walked among them, studying trunks and branches, watching how the forest floor rose and fell. He paid attention to where snow lingered from early flurries and where it melted first. He noted how the wind slipped through gaps in the trees and where it died away entirely. He did not rush. That, too, unsettled people. In a place where speed was survival, patience looked like ignorance. The settlement continued its work. Hammers rang, saws bit into wood. Smoke thickened as stoves were tested and adjusted. Repairs were made where gaps had formed, and every night fires burned a little longer. People measured their readiness by the height of their woodpiles and the thickness of their walls. They compared notes, reassured each other that they were prepared. The stranger did none of that. He carried few tools, and none of them suggested the construction of a conventional home. What he did carry, he used carefully, almost gently. He returned again and again to the same massive spruce at the edge of his land, an old tree whose trunk was thick enough that it took several people to encircle it. Its roots pushed up against the soil in long, uneven ridges, lifting the ground in subtle ways that most people would have considered a problem rather than an opportunity. The jokes sharpened when people noticed where he spent most of his time. A house beneath a tree was one thing. A house beneath the ground was another entirely. The idea offended the settlement's sense of progress, of having risen above the primitive struggle. Holes were for animals, not for people who believed themselves modern enough to conquer winter with axes and fire. Yet, he did not act like a man who had miscalculated. He did not appear anxious or hurried. Each morning he rose early, when frost still glittered on the needles and the air burned in the lungs. Each evening he worked until the light failed. He did not seek warmth from others, nor did he complain about the cold. He accepted it as a condition, not an enemy. At night, when the settlement settled into the rhythm of fires and enclosed spaces, he remained outside longer than anyone else. People noticed the faint sound of digging long after hammers had gone silent. They shook their heads, certain they were watching someone dig his own end. What they did not understand was that he was not building against the cold. He was reading it. He understood that winter punished surface mistakes first. He knew that wind did not care how proud a wall was, only how many paths it could find through it. He knew that fire was a hungry ally, demanding constant feeding and attention. And he knew, from lessons learned elsewhere, that the ground beneath their feet did not change its nature just because people ignored it. The forest had been here long before the settlement. The spruce had survived centuries of storms, freezes, thaws, and weight that would crush any poorly planned structure. Its roots had shaped the soil, drained water, and held warmth long after the sun disappeared. Snow did not threaten it. Snow protected it. These were not ideas the settlement valued. They believed in cutting and stacking, in fighting winter head-on. They believed that strength came from building higher and thicker. They believed that the earth was something to be escaped, not embraced. The stranger believed otherwise. By the time the first real snow dusted the ground, the difference between him and everyone else had become unmistakable. Cabins stood finished, or nearly so, their owners stepping back to admire their work with tired satisfaction. He, meanwhile, had no walls to show, no roof, nothing that resembled a home at all. Only disturbed earth near the old spruce marked his progress. The settlement took that as proof. They did not see preparation. They saw failure delayed. And as the days shortened and the air grew sharper, the laughter carried farther across the frozen ground, echoing between trees that had already begun to prepare for the weight of what was coming. The laughter that followed him through the settlement did not fade with familiarity. It hardened. What had begun as curiosity sharpened into judgment as days passed and the first real cold began to set into the land. People watched him from the corners of their eyes while pretending not to, measuring his progress against their own sense of survival. They saw no walls rising, no roof framing the sky, no chimney promising smoke and heat. To them, his calm was not confidence but denial. He felt the narrowing window more clearly than any of them. He understood time in terms of soil and temperature, not calendar dates. Each night the frost crept deeper. Each morning the ground resisted the shovel a little more. He knew he could not afford to build the way they did, even if he wanted to. Cutting trees, shaping logs, stacking walls, sealing gaps, all of it required weeks he did not have, and help he would not receive. Even if he somehow finished, he knew what those cabins demanded in return. Constant fire, endless fuel, vigilance without rest. He had lived through winters where men built well and still froze because the math had lied to them. So he chose not to play by rules designed for a different kind of certainty. While others worked upward, he worked inward. He learned the land not by claiming it, but by listening to it. He walked his plot slowly, sometimes standing still for long minutes, feeling how the wind moved across his face, how it accelerated in some places and vanished in others. He pressed his palm into the soil, noting where it stayed dry beneath the surface and where it held moisture. He followed animal tracks to see where creatures sought shelter when the cold tightened. Every detail mattered because every detail had already survived winters without tools, without walls, without fire. The massive spruce drew him back again and again. It was not the tallest tree in the forest, but it was the oldest, its bark thick and deeply ridged, its branches high and heavy. The ground around it rose slightly, shaped over decades by roots that pushed outward and upward, displacing soil and water alike. Where other areas stayed damp after snowfall, this place dried quickly. Where wind scoured open ground, the tree broke it, bending gusts into softer currents. He knew what the others saw. They saw obstruction. They saw a hazard that could fall, roots that could rot, shade that could block light. They saw the inconvenience of working around something instead of removing it. He saw a system that had already solved problems he would otherwise have to fight. When he began to dig, the settlement took it as confirmation of his foolishness. He did not dig aggressively or randomly. He worked carefully, peeling back layers rather than tearing through them. The first layer was the forest floor itself, thick with years of fallen needles and slow decay. It smelled rich and alive, nothing like the cold, dead soil exposed elsewhere. Beneath it lay earth that crumbled instead of clung, sandy enough to drain but firm enough to hold shape. He measured without measuring tools, using his own body as reference. The space would be long enough to lie fully stretched, wide enough to turn, deep enough to sink below the reach of the worst cold. He marked the shape with shallow cuts and began to lower it, inch by inch, preserving the integrity of the surrounding ground. Where roots appeared, he worked around them, never severing anything that pulsed with life. The settlement watched from a distance, shaking heads, occasionally calling out warnings that carried more mockery than care. They believed the ground would betray him, that water would fill the hole, that frost would claim it. They had never trusted the earth because they had never tried to understand it. Their homes stood above it, separated, protected only by what they built with their hands. He trusted what had endured. As the excavation deepened, something subtle changed. He felt it before he could name it. The air at the bottom of the pit was different. Still, not warm in the way fire warmed, but steady. When he pressed his bare hand against the exposed earth, it did not bite the way the air did. The cold was muted there, filtered. He recognized the sensation from other places, other winters, where the ground held a memory of heat long after the surface had forgotten it. That was the decision, fully formed, even if no one else could see it. He was not building shelter from the cold. He was stepping into a layer of the world where the cold had less authority. Each day he worked until his muscles burned and his breath came in slow, measured clouds. Each night he left the pit covered, protected from snowfall, preserving what he had exposed. He did not rush, but neither did he waste motion. Every movement had purpose because every wasted movement would have to be paid for later. The ridicule sharpened as his commitment became undeniable. People no longer asked if he would start building properly. They asked how long it would take before he froze to death. They framed their cruelty as realism, telling each other that winter would teach him what pride would not. Some took comfort in the idea that his failure would validate their own choices. What they did not see was calculation. He knew the ground beneath the frost line did not follow the same rules as the air above it. He knew living wood behaved differently from dead lumber, that it absorbed and released heat slowly instead of bleeding it away. He knew that snow, so feared by those who fought it, could become insulation when allowed to settle instead of being scraped away. He worked through the first snowfall without pause. The flakes melted on contact with the soil he had exposed, leaving only dampness that dried quickly in the still air of the pit. That alone should have been warning enough, but no one wanted to see it. They were too busy sealing their walls tighter, stacking more wood, reassuring themselves that effort equaled safety. By the time the hole had shape and depth enough to stand within, the settlement had stopped laughing out loud. The jokes retreated into murmurs. Curiosity crept in, uninvited. People slowed when they passed his land. They watched longer than they meant to. They still did not understand, but the certainty of his failure had begun to crack. He did not acknowledge the shift. He continued as if alone, working in rhythm with the land. The hole became a chamber. The chamber became a space that belonged to the earth more than to him. He shaped it with restraint, never forcing more than the soil was willing to give. As the days shortened further and the wind grew sharper, the settlement felt the first edge of fear. The season was turning faster than expected. Repairs that should have waited until spring were now impossible. Wood disappeared from stacks more quickly than planned. Fires burned longer into the night. The stranger, meanwhile, sank deeper into the ground. By the time the soil resisted him with real stiffness, he had already gone far enough. He stood at the bottom of his excavation and felt the truth of his choice settle into his bones. The earth held steady. The cold hovered above him, not around him. The massive spruce loomed at the edge, its roots framing the space like ribs, alive and unbroken. The decision was complete. What came next would test it, not with opinions or laughter, but with winter itself. The excavation marked the moment when doubt ceased to matter. Once the decision had settled fully into his body, once the shape of the space existed not only in his mind but in the soil itself, the work took on a different character. It was no longer about proving anything to anyone. It became a conversation between his hands and the land. A careful negotiation where force had no place and patience carried more weight than strength. The deeper he went, the more the world above receded. Sounds softened first. The sharp crack of splitting wood from neighboring plots dulled into distant thuds. Voices carried strangely, flattened and distorted, as if filtered through layers of earth and root. Even the wind lost its edge. What remained was a steady quiet, broken only by the scrape of tool against soil and the slow rhythm of his breathing. He shaped the interior deliberately. He did not hollow out a simple pit because pits collapsed and collected water. Instead, he carved a chamber with intention, giving it subtle curves rather than sharp angles, allowing pressure to distribute naturally through the surrounding earth. The floor sloped gently toward one side, barely perceptible, just enough to guide any moisture away from the space where he would sleep. He tamped the surface until it was firm, not polished, not fragile, something that would resist erosion and remain stable over time. As roots emerged from the walls, he treated them not as obstacles, but as boundaries. Thick roots were left exposed, cleaned of loose soil, their surfaces smoothed by hand. They arched through the space like living beams, strong and flexible, older than the settlement itself. Smaller roots formed natural ledges and pockets, and he adjusted the chamber's dimensions to incorporate them rather than cut them away. Where a root dipped low, he lowered the floor beneath it. Where another rose high, he allowed the ceiling to follow. The air within the chamber was different from the air above, even before any covering existed. It was heavier, yes, but also calmer. Temperature did not shift as sharply when clouds passed or when the sun dipped behind the trees. The earth held a baseline that resisted sudden change. He tested it by stepping out into the open and then returning, feeling the contrast settle across his skin. The cold stung outside, sharp and demanding. Inside, it faded into something tolerable, something quiet. He carved a raised platform along one wall, shaped directly from the soil and reinforced by a web of roots beneath it. This would be the sleeping area, lifted enough to avoid ground chill but close enough to the Earth's mass to benefit from its stored warmth. He compressed the surface until it held his weight without shifting, then lined it with layers of dry needles and bark he had gathered and set aside earlier. Each layer served a purpose, separating his body from moisture while trapping air between fibers. Storage followed the same philosophy. Instead of building shelves, he widened natural cavities between roots, creating shallow recesses where tools and supplies could rest without cluttering the central space. Nothing was wasted. Every cubic inch mattered because every cubic inch held heat. The roof was the most delicate task, not because of complexity, but because failure there would undo everything. He selected supports carefully, choosing straight pieces of wood strong enough to bear weight without excessive thickness. These primary supports span the chamber from root to root, resting where the earth itself could carry the load. They were placed low, creating a ceiling that would feel almost oppressive to someone accustomed to open rooms, but that closeness was intentional. Heat would have nowhere to rise and escape. Across these supports, he laid thinner pieces, close together, forming a dense lattice. Gaps were minimized but not eliminated entirely. The structure needed to breathe, to release moisture slowly rather than trap it. Over this framework he layered spruce boughs, thick and overlapping, their needles angled downward so water would shed away from the chamber rather than seep through. He worked methodically, building thickness without creating weight that would strain the supports. The final layers came from the land itself. Bark slabs peeled from fallen trees, laid like shingles. Dry soil packed carefully over everything, pressed and smoothed until it blended seamlessly with the surrounding ground. From a distance, the roof did not look like a roof at all. It looked like a slight rise in the forest floor, an extension of what had always been there. The entrance was left for last because it defined how the space would interact with the outside world. He did not carve a straight opening. Instead, he dug a short passage that sloped downward before rising into the main chamber. Cold air, heavier than warm, would settle into the lowest point and remain there, trapped. Warm air would collect above it, where he lived and slept. It was a simple principle, ignored by most builders because it conflicted with their desire for convenience and height. He oriented the entrance away from the prevailing wind, angling it toward the rare winter sun. Even weak light carried warmth, and he intended to capture every advantage the season offered. A simple closure, layered cloth backed by wood, sealed the opening without making it airtight. Air needed to move, just not in a hurry. Ventilation came next. A small opening near the roofline allowed smoke to escape when he used fire, positioned so that wind would not force cold air back down into the chamber. He tested it with small burns, watching how smoke moved, adjusting angles until it rose cleanly and steadily. He lined the fire pit with stone, not to build impressive flames, but to store heat. The stones absorbed warmth and released it slowly long after the fire burned down. By the time the structure was complete, snow had begun to fall in earnest. Light at first, then thicker, settling into the forest with a muffled hush. He welcomed it. Snow filled irregularities, sealed tiny gaps, added insulation no human material could match. Each inch increased the shelter's effectiveness. The first night he slept inside the completed space marked a turning point he did not celebrate outwardly. He lay on the raised platform, listening to the distant wind move through branches above him, feeling the steadiness beneath his back. The cold did not press in. It hovered somewhere beyond reach, muted and manageable. He did not wake every hour. He did not need to tend fire through the night. His breath remained slow and even. Morning came without shock. When he emerged briefly to check the outside, the contrast struck him with clarity. The air burned his lungs. His fingers stiffened within moments. He returned underground and felt relief spread not as luxury, but as function. The shelter worked. Others noticed the difference before they admitted it to themselves. They saw him emerge rested while they moved stiffly, faces drawn, hands cracked from constant exposure to heat and cold. They smelled less smoke on his clothes. They noticed his woodpile shrinking slowly rather than vanishing overnight. No one said anything yet. Pride held them back, but something fundamental had shifted. While cabins stood tall and obvious, demanding constant attention, his home disappeared into the land, requiring almost nothing. It did not fight winter. It sidestepped it. And as the cold deepened and the season tightened its grip, that distinction would soon matter more than anyone was ready to admit. The ground had accepted his presence. The forest had absorbed his shelter into itself. What remained was to see whether the winter would accept it as well. Winter did not arrive all at once. It advanced the way pressure builds deep underground, unseen at first, then impossible to ignore. The days shortened until light felt rationed, the sun skimming the horizon like something unsure of its welcome. Frost appeared each morning with increasing confidence, coating the ground in brittle white, stiffening leaves, glazing exposed wood. The air changed texture, turning sharper, drier, less forgiving to the lungs. Every breath carried consequence now. For the settlement, this was the phase when preparation turned into rehearsal. Fires were no longer occasional comforts but constant necessities. Stoves were lit before dawn and fed until well past nightfall. People began to measure nights by how often they woke to tend the flames, how quickly the warmth fled once the fire slackened. Cabins that had felt solid a week earlier began to reveal their weaknesses. Wood shrank as temperatures dropped, opening hairline cracks along corners and seams. What had been sealed tight in mild weather now admitted thin knives of cold air that slipped through unnoticed until fingers numbed and toes ached. Men and women patched what they could. Mud was pressed back into gaps, rags stuffed where wood no longer met cleanly. But repairs never held for long. Each cycle of heating and cooling widened flaws faster than hands could seal them. Wind found every weakness, testing each wall with patient persistence. At night, the sound of it crept through cabins like a living thing, whistling softly through seams, rattling loose boards, reminding everyone that their shelters were temporary agreements with forces that did not negotiate. Fuel consumption climbed. Wood piles shrank at a rate that unsettled even those who had prepared well. Calculations made in autumn no longer felt reliable. Fires burned hotter, longer, hungrier. The heat they produced seemed to vanish upward, collecting uselessly near ceilings, while the floors remained cold enough to numb feet through thick boots. Sleeping became fragmented. People dozed lightly, alert to the sound of shifting embers, ready to rise before the cold could reclaim the room. Against this backdrop, the man at the forest's edge lived differently. He did not announce his comfort. He did not boast or display it, but it showed in ways that were impossible to hide. He moved with steadier energy. His hands were less raw, his posture less guarded. He spent fewer hours tending fire and more time attending to small tasks that others postponed out of exhaustion. When he emerged from the earth in the morning, his breath still clouded, but his face did not carry the same tight strain visible elsewhere in the settlement. Inside his shelter, the temperature changed slowly, if at all. The ground beneath him remained faithful to its deeper rules, holding warmth accumulated over months and releasing it without urgency. The living roots that framed the chamber acted as quiet reservoirs, absorbing heat from his small fire and releasing it long after the embers faded. Snow gathered above the roof in soft layers, sealing the structure further, thickening the boundary between him and the open air. He felt the difference most clearly at night. While others slept in cycles dictated by fire, he slept according to his body's needs. He did not wake to stoke flames or shake feeling back into his limbs. The silence of the earth around him was complete, insulating not only his body, but his thoughts. Rest came fully, deeply, without interruption. Outside, the settlement struggled through the same nights. People began to notice patterns they had not wanted to see. They noticed that he was not rushing to gather more wood, that his pile diminished slowly, almost modestly. They noticed that he did not carry the faint smell of smoke that clung to everyone else, the scent of constant burning that seeped into clothing and hair. They noticed that while others moved stiffly in the mornings, joints protesting the cold, he stretched and went about his work with calm efficiency. At first, these observations were dismissed. Some said he must be burning fuel secretly at night. Others claimed the cold had not yet truly arrived and that his luck would soon run out. It was easier to believe in delayed failure than to question methods that had always been accepted as truth. But as the days passed, the evidence accumulated. The first real test came with a sudden drop in temperature that caught the settlement off guard. A clear night followed by brutal stillness. Without wind to moderate the cold, the air turned dense and heavy, sinking into every low place. By dawn, the temperature had plunged far below what anyone had expected so early in the season. Cabins responded immediately. Interiors that had hovered just above comfort dropped into the range where breath fogged visibly indoors. Floors radiated cold upward, stealing warmth from bodies no matter how close they pressed to the fire. Fires burned continuously, yet the warmth they produced seemed thin, fleeting, constantly on the verge of collapse. The man beneath the spruce felt the change only faintly. The air in his chamber cooled by degrees, not by shocks. The earth absorbed the loss and resisted it. His small fire compensated easily, requiring little additional fuel. He noticed the cold the way one notices distant weather, aware of it without being dominated by it. Small crises began to ripple through the settlement. One family discovered that a section of their woodpile had absorbed moisture from the ground and now burned poorly, producing smoke instead of heat. Another found that their stove draft behaved unpredictably in the colder air, forcing constant adjustment. Someone woke to find a water container frozen solid inside their cabin, despite a fire burning through the night. Each incident was manageable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that eroded confidence. The contrast sharpened when early snowfall turned to sleet, coating surfaces in ice before freezing hard. Roofs grew heavier. Wind returned, driving cold rain sideways into walls not designed to repel it. Dampness crept into spaces meant to remain dry. Fires worked harder, consuming more wood to evaporate moisture before producing usable heat. The underground shelter responded differently. Water shed naturally down the layered roof and into the soil beyond the chamber. Moisture did not linger inside. The temperature remained stable enough that condensation never became a problem. Dryness preserved warmth, and warmth preserved strength. People began to linger near his land under the pretense of passing through. They slowed their steps, listening, observing. Some bent to feel the ground near his entrance, surprised by the lack of frost. Others watched the snow settle and remain undisturbed, puzzled by how something so invisible could feel so secure. No one asked questions yet. Pride remained intact, though strained, but curiosity had replaced mockery. The laughter that once carried easily across the frozen ground had vanished. In its place was a quieter tension, a sense that something fundamental was being challenged. The man noticed the shift without reacting to it. He did not invite inspection. He did not conceal his methods either. He continued his routine, adjusting small details as needed, refining airflow, redistributing insulation, responding to the season with measured adaptation rather than resistance. One evening, as darkness fell early and cold thickened the air, he stepped outside and looked across the settlement. Smoke rose from every chimney, heavy and constant, hanging low in the still air. It was the smoke of effort, of fuel consumed faster than expected, of people working harder each day for diminishing returns. He returned underground and sealed the entrance behind him. The quiet closed in. The earth resumed its steady presence. Above him, the settlement continued to burn and patch and worry. Below, his shelter held. The first frost had done more than test structures. It had begun to test beliefs. And as winter pressed closer, the difference between fighting the cold and avoiding its reach would soon become impossible to ignore. The storm announced itself long before it arrived. The sky lowered over several days, clouds thickening into a dull, unbroken lid that pressed down on the land. The air grew restless, moving in uneasy currents that shifted direction without warning. Birds disappeared from the open spaces. Even the forest seemed to brace itself, branches tightening, needles clinging close as if aware of what was coming. The settlement felt it in the way sound carried less clearly and in how the cold settled earlier each evening, refusing to lift even at midday. When the storm finally broke, it did not do so gently. Snow began to fall sideways, driven by a wind that cut through clothing and skin alike. Visibility collapsed within hours. The road vanished first, then the spaces between buildings until the settlement became a cluster of dark shapes half swallowed by white. The temperature plunged sharply, faster than anyone had prepared for. What had been cold became dangerous, and what had been uncomfortable became lethal. Inside the cabins, the response was immediate and frantic. Fires were stoked hard, flames roaring louder as people fed them faster and faster. The air inside grew thick with smoke and heat near the ceiling while the floors remained brutally cold. Wind forced its way through every weakness, every seam that had seemed insignificant days earlier. The sound of it filled the rooms, a constant hiss and moan that made sleep nearly impossible. Snow pressed against walls and piled against doors, seeping into cracks, melting, refreezing, and widening the gaps it entered. Wood disappeared at an alarming rate. People began to burn through reserves they had believed sufficient for weeks in a matter of days. The rhythm of survival shifted entirely. No one rested for long. Every few hours, someone rose to feed the fire, check the walls, clear snow from the roof. Exhaustion set in quickly, dulling judgment and slowing reactions. Hands fumbled, tools slipped. Small mistakes carried consequences that grew more severe by the hour. One cabin lost part of its roof when a gust caught an exposed edge and tore it loose, sending snow and ice cascading inside. Another found its stove draft reversing under the pressure of the wind, forcing smoke back into the room and filling the space with choking fumes. People moved between buildings only when absolutely necessary, wrapped in layers, faces covered, eyes squinting against the biting cold. Every trip outside felt like a gamble. In contrast, the shelter beneath the spruce disappeared almost completely. Snow buried the roof until it blended seamlessly into the forest floor. The entrance became a shallow depression rather than an opening, shielded from the worst of the wind by the tree's massive trunk and the surrounding roots. Above ground, the storm raged with unrestrained violence. Below, it became a distant presence, a muted pressure rather than an assault. Inside, the temperature shifted only slightly. The earth absorbed the shock of the cold and released its stored warmth without urgency. The living wood around the chamber responded slowly, evenly, never panicking. The man tended his small fire with care, adding fuel only when necessary. The stones around the pit warmed and held that warmth, radiating it back into the space long after the flames subsided. Sound behaved differently underground. The howling wind became a low, continuous murmur, more vibration than noise. Snowfall registered only as a faint, distant hush. The chaos above was translated into something almost calming below, stripped of its sharp edges. The shelter did not feel like a refuge stolen from danger. It felt like a place that danger could not easily reach. Hours passed, then a day, then another. Above ground, the settlement began to fracture under the strain. Sleep deprivation compounded the cold. People's movements grew slower, their thinking less clear. Minor injuries went unnoticed until they worsened. Fingers lost sensation. Toes stiffened. Breath froze visibly inside rooms that should have been warm. The fires demanded constant attention, and when they faltered even briefly, the cold rushed back with startling speed, reclaiming space as if it had never left. Snow accumulation became a new threat. Roofs sagged under the weight. Clearing them required venturing outside repeatedly, exposing people to wind that stripped heat in seconds. The effort consumed energy that could not be replaced easily, as eating became more difficult and appetites vanished under stress. Food froze. Water containers cracked. The simple acts of living required planning and effort beyond what anyone had anticipated. The man beneath the spruce emerged only when necessary. Each time he did, the contrast struck him anew. The cold seized his skin immediately, biting through layers, demanding retreat. He limited his exposure carefully, knowing that his strength lay in conservation, not endurance. When he returned underground, warmth enveloped him again, steady and reliable. His body did not need to fight to recover. It simply resumed its balance. By the second night of the storm, desperation began to show openly in the settlement. Shouts carried through the wind as people called to one another, coordinating repairs, warning of failures. One family abandoned their cabin entirely after realizing they could no longer keep it habitable, pushing through the storm to seek refuge with neighbors. Overcrowding followed, straining heating capacity even further. More bodies meant more moisture, more oxygen consumed, more fuel burned. The cycle tightened. The underground shelter, by contrast, remained unchanged. Snow added insulation rather than pressure. Wind passed overhead without finding purchase. The earth maintained its quiet authority, enforcing its own rules regardless of what happened above. On the third day, the storm reached its peak. Temperatures plunged to levels rarely seen so early in the season. The air outside became something that punished exposure instantly. Skin numbed in moments. Metal burned to the touch. Breath crystallized in the lungs. The settlement existed in a state of siege, each structure fighting its own battle with dwindling resources. That night, as the wind screamed through the trees and snow piled higher, the man sat quietly in his shelter, listening. He was aware, with a clarity that came only from stillness, that the difference between his situation and that of the others was no longer a matter of comfort. It was a matter of survival. The methods the settlement had trusted were failing under sustained pressure. The system he had chosen was not merely holding, it was thriving. He did not feel triumph, he felt concern, because storms end. And when this one did, the consequences would not disappear with it. The cold would linger, supplies would be depleted, bodies would be weakened. The storm was not an isolated event but a test that revealed what would come next. As the wind continued its relentless assault, burying the settlement deeper into winter's grip, the earth around him remained steady, unchanged by the violence above. And for the first time since his arrival, the man understood that the shelter he had built was no longer just his. It would soon become something the others could not afford to ignore. The storm did not end cleanly. It loosened its grip slowly, reluctantly, as if testing whether the land had learned its lesson. The wind eased first, dropping from a scream to a constant pressure that still cut through clothing and resolve. Snowfall thinned into a steady drift that continued to bury what remained exposed. The temperature, however, did not rise. It settled deeper, pressing down with a weight that made every movement costly and every decision consequential. When morning finally came after the third night, the settlement emerged altered. What had once been a collection of independent shelters now felt like a fragile organism pushed beyond its limits. Smoke still rose from chimneys, but thinner, uneven, faltering. Doors opened cautiously, only when necessary. People moved less, conserving strength they no longer trusted would return easily. Inside the cabins, the damage was no longer superficial. Walls that had endured earlier cold now radiated it. Wood that had been dried carefully cracked and warped under the stress of constant heating and freezing. Gaps widened to the point where stuffing them became pointless. Cold no longer entered as a draft. It occupied space. It sat in corners and along floors, refusing to be chased away by flame. The people who had once laughed the loudest were among the first to show it. Their confidence had depended on routine, on the belief that effort alone could overcome the season. Now, effort only deepened their exhaustion. They rose to tend fires with shaken hands. They misjudged how much fuel to add, burning too hot at one moment and too low the next. Sleep deprivation dulled their senses. They forgot tools outside and lost them under snow. They dropped things and lacked the energy to retrieve them. Hunger followed quickly. Cold devoured calories at a rate no one had calculated correctly. Food supplies that had seemed generous now shrank alarmingly. Frozen provisions required heat to prepare, and heat required fuel that was already scarce. People ate less, not by choice, but by necessity, and their bodies paid the price. Muscles weakened, reaction times slowed, small injuries lingered instead of healing. Frostbite appeared quietly, a numb toe ignored during the night. Fingers stiffened after clearing snow too long without proper gloves. Ears that burned and then went strangely painless. These were not dramatic injuries, but they carried an unspoken terror. Everyone knew what they meant if allowed to progress. Everyone knew how far away proper help was. One cabin failed completely on the fourth night after the storm's peak. The fire burned low as its occupant slept, and when he woke, the cold had already claimed the space. His breath crystallized instantly. His hands would not close properly. He wrapped himself in everything he owned and fled into the dark, stumbling through drifts towards the nearest light. He survived the walk by chance, more than strength arriving barely conscious, his condition a warning that no one could ignore. The settlement responded by consolidating. People abandoned the weakest structures and crowded into those that seemed marginally better. The logic was understandable and flawed. More bodies meant more shared warmth, but also more moisture, more oxygen consumed, and far greater fuel demands. Fires burned faster. Air grew stale. Carbon monoxide became a real risk as people sealed spaces too tightly in desperation. In one cabin, 2 men rotated sleep in short shifts, one resting while the other tended the fire, both too exhausted to think clearly. In another, a family slept sitting upright because the floor had become too cold to tolerate. No one spoke of comfort anymore. Survival itself felt precarious. Through all of this, the man beneath the spruce remained steady. He observed the settlement from a distance, not out of detachment but caution. He limited his time above ground, knowing that prolonged exposure would weaken him as surely as it weakened the others. Each time he surfaced briefly, the contrast struck him harder. The cold outside felt more hostile now, more aggressive, as if it sensed vulnerability everywhere except in the quiet pocket beneath the tree. Inside his shelter, the air remained dry and calm. The temperature fluctuated within a narrow range, never dropping far enough to demand constant fire, never rising enough to create discomfort. His fuel consumption remained modest. He tracked it carefully, not out of fear, but habit. He knew exactly how much he had used and how much remained, and the numbers did not trouble him. He slept through the night, fully, deeply, wake and rested. His hands retained dexterity. His thoughts stayed clear. This clarity, more than warmth, separated him from the others now. He could plan, he could evaluate, he could choose, and the choice was approaching him whether he wanted it or not. The first sign came in the way people began to look at his land. No longer with ridicule, not even with curiosity, but with something closer to calculation. Eyes lingered on the barely visible entrance. Conversations paused when he appeared. Words went unsaid, hanging in the air like breath that refused to dissipate. He understood the hesitation. To ask for help would mean admitting that everything they had believed, built, and defended was failing. It would mean acknowledging that the hole in the ground they had mocked was outperforming their carefully constructed homes. Pride does not yield easily, especially when it has been sharpened into cruelty. The breaking point came quietly. One evening, as darkness settled and the temperature sank further, he heard movement near his entrance. It was slow, unsteady, punctuated by pauses that spoke of pain and fatigue. He waited, listening until the sounds resolved into the unmistakable presence of someone nearby. When he opened the entrance slightly, cold air spilled down the tunnel, sharp and immediate. The figure outside stood hunched, shoulders drawn inward, breath ragged. Frost clung to his clothing. His face, barely visible in the dim light, was tight with strain. This was one of the men who had laughed openly during the early days, whose voice had carried mockery across the frozen ground. Now there was no laughter left in him. He did not speak at first. He stood there, swaying slightly, as if unsure whether he was still welcome in the world of the living. The silence between them held more weight than any words could have. The man beneath the spruce understood that this moment was not about shelter alone. It was about whether the line between isolation and community would be crossed. He could have refused. He could have protected his space, his warmth, his hard-won stability. The shelter was designed for one. Adding another body would change its balance, increase demands, introduce risk. From a purely practical standpoint, turning the man away would have been defensible, but the winter had already revealed enough about practicality stripped of humanity. He opened the entrance wider and stepped back, allowing warmth to rise and spill outward in a way that needed no explanation. The effect was immediate. The man's posture shifted, relief flooding into muscles that had been clenched too long. He descended slowly, carefully, into the chamber, each step a surrender of pride. Once inside, the transformation was visible. Color returned gradually to skin. Breathing steadied. The tension that had locked his body into survival mode began to ease. He did not need to be told anything. The difference was undeniable. Word spread quickly after that, carried not by speech, but by absence. One cabin went dark earlier than usual, another burned less fiercely. Shapes moved through the snow toward the forest's edge, one by one, always after nightfall, always quietly. The man beneath the spruce understood what was happening and prepared accordingly. He cleared space. He adjusted ventilation. He rationed fuel with greater precision. He did not scold or remind or demand apologies. There was no need. The cold had already done that work. By the end of that night, his shelter held more than warmth. It held the fragile beginnings of something the settlement had nearly lost entirely: trust. And outside, the winter waited, indifferent, ready to test what would happen next. By the time the second night ended, the underground chamber no longer belonged to one man alone. It had become something shared, though not casually and not without tension. The transition happened quietly, without announcement or agreement, shaped by necessity rather than intention. Winter had stripped the settlement down to essentials, and warmth was the most essential of all. Those who arrived did so cautiously, often alone at first, sometimes supported by others who could no longer hide how badly they were faring. They came wrapped in layers stiff with frost, faces drawn tight by exhaustion and fear. Each descent through the low-entrance tunnel marked a crossing that went beyond physical movement. They were leaving behind not just Phelan shelters, but certainty, pride, and the belief that they understood how the world worked. Inside, the contrast was immediate and overwhelming. The air was warmer, but more than that, it was stable. It did not bite. It did not demand attention. For people who had spent days and nights fighting an invisible enemy that drained strength hour by hour, this calm felt unreal at first, almost suspicious. Muscles remained tense even after entering, bodies slow to trust that the cold would not suddenly reclaim them. The man who had built the shelter moved deliberately, adjusting to the new reality without panic. He understood that adding bodies changed everything. More heat was generated, yes, but also more moisture, more breath, more demand on the system that had been carefully balanced for one. He responded not with speeches or instructions, but with action. He shifted supplies into tighter order. He cleared unnecessary items to create space. He opened and adjusted ventilation points with small, precise movements, ensuring air continued to circulate without bleeding warmth away. People watched him closely now, not with mockery, not even with curiosity, but with a kind of focused attention reserved for someone who clearly understood something vital. He did not position himself as a leader, yet his authority emerged naturally from competence. He did not raise his voice or issue commands. He demonstrated, and others followed. Clothing was hung where warmth could reach it without trapping moisture. Boots were placed carefully so they would not freeze solid overnight. The fire pit remained small, controlled. Its stones warmed steadily rather than overheated. He limited fuel use with firm consistency, resisting the instinct to overfeed the flames. At first, this unsettled those who had learned to associate survival with roaring fires, but as minutes passed and warmth held steady, their anxiety began to ease. One by one, bodies relaxed, shivering slowed, hands unclenched, breathing deepened. Some people simply sat in silence, eyes closed, as if afraid that speaking might break the fragile balance they had entered. Others leaned against the earth walls, surprised by their solidity, by the sense that the ground itself was holding them upright. The shelter filled not with gratitude at first, but with something heavier. Shame surfaced in quiet ways, averted eyes, stiff apologies that went unfinished. The memory of laughter and cruelty lingered in the space between people, unspoken but present. The man who had built the shelter did not acknowledge it. He did not forgive or condemn. He focused on maintaining the system, because that was what kept everyone alive. Outside, the cold persisted. The storm had passed, but winter had not loosened its grip. The temperature remained brutally low, the kind that punished even brief exposure. Cabins left unattended grew colder by the hour. Fires died out, and with them any illusion that those structures could be reclaimed easily. Snow-sealed doors shut. Roofs sagged under accumulated weight. The settlement above ground slowly emptied, its life retreating into the earth. Inside the shelter, time behaved differently. Without the constant urgency of fire maintenance, hours regained their shape. People slept longer stretches than they had in days, sometimes in the same position they had collapsed into, too tired to move. When they woke, confusion came first, followed by disbelief as they realized they were still warm. Food was shared carefully. Portions were small, but digestion improved once bodies no longer burned energy just to stay above freezing. Strength returned gradually, unevenly. Frost-bitten fingers regained sensation with painful slowness. Muscles stopped trembling, thought cleared. As the nights continued, the shelter's role shifted again. It was no longer simply a refuge from the cold. It became a place where people began to understand what had happened to them. They spoke quietly, voices low out of habit and respect for the confined space. Conversations were brief and practical at first, focused on who had made it through the night, who was still outside, what supplies remained. Slowly, inevitably, the subject of the shelter itself surfaced, not as accusation or debate, but as wonder. How could this be warmer than a house? How could so little fire do so much? How could the ground, which they had feared, provide safety where walls had failed? The man answered when asked, but he did not lecture. He explained simply, grounding every point in what they could feel around them. The steady temperature, the absence of drafts, the way snow above them insulated instead of threatening collapse. He spoke of the earth below the frost line, of living wood that held warmth, of spaces designed to keep heat close rather than let it escape upward. He described it not as innovation, but as listening. These explanations did not come with judgment. That, more than anything, shifted the tone of the shelter. People realized that he had not built this way to prove anyone wrong. He had built it to survive. The rest had been a consequence. One night marked the true turning point. The temperature dropped again, lower than it had during the storm. Outside, the air became so cold that sound itself seemed to fracture. Inside abandoned cabins, anything liquid froze solid. Walls groaned under stress. What little heat remained in those structures vanished entirely. Inside the earth shelter, the change was almost imperceptible. The air cooled by a few degrees, enough to notice but not enough to threaten. Bodies adjusted easily. The fire was fed slightly more than usual, then allowed to settle. The stone held the warmth. The earth responded, as it always had, slowly, evenly. That night, everyone slept, not in turns, not lightly, not with one ear trained on the sound of shifting embers. They slept as people sleep when their bodies believe they will wake again. Morning came without urgency. When some emerged to assess the settlement, the damage was clear. Several cabins were no longer habitable. Others would require extensive work before they could shelter anyone again. Supplies were depleted beyond what anyone had anticipated. The cost of survival had been far higher than expected. They returned underground with this knowledge, carrying it like weight. No one argued anymore. No one questioned why the shelter worked. The evidence surrounded them. Instead, conversation turned toward what came next. Winter was far from over. The shelter could not hold everyone indefinitely. More solutions were needed, and quickly. The man listened as others spoke, offering ideas, suggestions, half-formed plans. For the first time since his arrival, he saw something change in the settlement beyond survival. Cooperation emerged not as idealism, but as strategy. People began to think in terms of systems rather than individual cabins. They asked how similar shelters could be built, where, how fast, with what tools. He did not claim ownership of the idea. He did not insist on being central to the process. He shared what he knew and stepped back, allowing others to adapt it to their own needs and abilities. This, too, surprised them. They had expected conditions, control, perhaps resentment. Instead, they found practicality and restraint. By the end of that week, the shelter beneath the spruce had become something larger than a physical space. It was a reference point, proof that their assumptions had been incomplete. That strength did not always come from building bigger or burning more, but from aligning with forces that did not exhaust themselves. The laughter that had once echoed across the settlement felt distant now, almost unreal. In its place was a quieter awareness, shaped by cold nights and narrow margins. Above them, winter continued, indifferent and absolute. Below, in the earth that had been mocked and dismissed, people found not just warmth, but the chance to endure together. And as they prepared to face the remaining months of cold, one truth had settled firmly among them. They would not survive this winter by returning to what they had believed before. They would survive it by changing. Spring did not arrive with celebration. It came cautiously, as if uncertain it was welcome after what the land had endured. The first signs were subtle, easy to miss if one expected warmth and green. Snow softened before it vanished. Ice loosened its grip on branches and roofs, dripping steadily through long afternoons. The sun lingered a little longer each day, not enough to erase the cold, but enough to remind the valley that time was still moving forward. When the ground finally began to release what it had held for months, the true cost of the winter revealed itself. Cabins emerged first, stripped of the illusion they had carried in autumn. Walls that once looked solid were scarred with deep cracks and warped seams. Roofs sagged permanently under damage they could not fully recover from. Doors hung crooked on swollen frames. Inside, floors were stained where snowmelt had seeped in and refrozen over and over, weakening everything it touched. Some structures stood only because the snow had held them upright. Without it, they leaned, fragile and exposed. Woodpiles told their own story. Many were gone entirely. Others were reduced to scattered remnants, damp and unusable. Burn marks scarred door frames and furniture where desperation had driven people to sacrifice parts of their own homes to stay alive. The settlement looked older than it had any right to, as if several seasons had passed instead of one. The people looked different, too. Weight had been lost unevenly, not in the way of labor, but in the way of long strain. Faces were sharper. Eyes carried a tired awareness that had not been there before. Movements were slower, more deliberate. Injuries lingered, some minor, some permanent. Fingers that no longer bent quite right. Toes that remained numb even as temperatures rose. Scars left by frost that would never fully fade. And yet, there was life. Everyone who had taken shelter beneath the spruce had survived. As the snow retreated from the forest floor, the underground shelter revealed itself gradually. The roof emerged first as a low, rounded rise in the earth, intact, unshifted, exactly as it had been before winter sealed it away. When the entrance was cleared and opened fully for the first time in months, the chamber inside looked almost unchanged, dry, stable. The air carried the faint scent of earth and wood, not rot or smoke. The man who had built it stepped out into the light of early spring with a body that surprised even him. He was not weakened by the winter. If anything, he felt steadier, more grounded, as if months of uninterrupted rest and controlled effort had restored something he had not known was missing. His movements were unhurried, his strength intact. Others noticed. There was no formal reckoning, no public apology, no dramatic reversal of roles. The settlement was not a place for speeches, but something fundamental had shifted. Where laughter had once followed him, now there was silence of a different kind. Respect, not loud or performative, but present in the way people watched and listened. Work resumed as the ground softened. What surprised the man was not that people repaired their cabins, but how they approached it. Fewer walls were raised anew. Instead, attention turned to the forest edge, to the land itself. People walked their plots differently now. They pressed hands into soil. They watched how water moved when the thaw came. They noticed which areas dried first and which stayed cold and wet. The first to act were those who had suffered the most. They began digging, not recklessly but cautiously, echoing the movements they had observed all winter. Shallow at first, testing the ground, learning where roots ran and where the soil held firm. There was no mockery this time, no audience. Just quiet, purposeful labor driven by the understanding that another winter would come and they would not face it unprepared again. The man helped when asked. He did not take over or dictate. He answered questions with patience, explaining principles rather than instructions. He spoke of depth, of airflow, of how small spaces retained heat more effectively than large ones. He showed how to work around roots instead of against them, how to let living wood become part of the structure rather than something to be removed. Different versions of the shelter began to appear. Some larger, built to house families. Some smaller, intended as backup refuges rather than primary homes. A few incorporated lessons learned from the failures of the cabins, adding reinforced entrances or secondary ventilation paths. The land became a quiet workshop, shaped by hands that had learned humility through cold. By early summer, the settlement no longer looked like it had before. Cabins still stood, repaired as best they could be, but they were no longer the only answer. Earth-sheltered spaces dotted the edges of the forest, partially hidden, blending into the terrain rather than dominating it. They were not uniform. Each reflected the builder's needs and understanding, but all shared the same core idea. Work was different now. There was less waste, less urgency. People planned with seasons rather than days in mind. Wood was cut and stored not just for burning, but for reinforcing earth structures where necessary. Food was cached with care, some of it stored underground where temperature remained stable even in summer heat. Conversations changed as well. The winter was spoken of not as a disaster, but as a lesson. Stories circulated quietly about the nights when fires failed, about the cold that crept across floors and into bones. But alongside those memories were others, of warmth held without struggle, of sleep uninterrupted by fear, of a shelter that had not demanded more than it gave. The man remained somewhat apart, not by exclusion, but by choice. He had not come seeking community, and he did not suddenly become its center. He continued to live simply, maintaining his shelter even as he improved it, adjusting drainage, refining ventilation, strengthening areas that experience had revealed as vulnerable. When autumn approached again, it did so without panic. People prepared, but they did not rush blindly. They tested shelters early, spending nights inside them before the cold demanded it. They measured fuel use carefully and found that their needs were far lower than the year before. The settlement no longer depended entirely on fire to survive. It depended on understanding. On the first truly cold night of the new season, smoke rose less heavily from chimneys. Some cabins remained dark, their occupants already settled underground. The forest absorbed the change without comment. The spruce at the edge of the man's land stood as it always had, its roots deep, its presence steady. No one laughed anymore. Winter came again, as it always would, but it found a different settlement waiting, one that had learned, at great cost, that survival was not about dominating the land or proving strength through excess. It was about alignment, about listening, about accepting that the earth offered protection to those willing to meet it on its terms. The man watched the first snow fall from the entrance of his shelter, feeling the familiar quiet settle around him. He thought of the season before, of the isolation, the mockery, the cold faces turned away. He did not dwell on it. The winter had taken those things and transformed them into something else. Above ground, the snow thickened. Below, the earth held steady, and in that balance, the settlement endured. If this story made you see survival differently, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story where real choices, real cold, and real consequences decide who lives and who doesn't. Watch the next video on the screen and explore other stories on the channel that reveal how people survive when everything works against them. Share this video with someone who loves true survival stories and lessons that still matter today.